But I guess what really drove me was the hope. So generally patients don't go on clinical trials unless they're failing their current therapies. So it was the hope that we could.
Thank you very much, Jessica, for sitting down with us today for HBG, the podcast. How are you today?
I'm well, thank you. And you?
Yes, cannot complain. It's funny because, we obviously tried to get you on the podcast last year around the start of winter time, but as everyone knows, the whole country pretty much went back into a crazy lockdown, so that wasn't able to happen. Obviously, things kind of got moved around, but I'm really, really happy that we were able to get you on this time around.
No worries. It's my pleasure.
And thank you very much. So today we're obviously, we've gotten you on because of your role within the healthcare industry, where you've come from, the kind of realms and businesses and companies that you've worked with, going from a clinical standpoint into pharma, but also it's International Women's Day, so it was really important for us as a business and as HPG Engage to reach out to women like yourself who've done amazing work throughout the healthcare and pharmaceutical industry. But just before we get into it, find out a little bit about you, your career, and the place that you've worked, we just want to start off with a little riddle, which I found quite interesting.
No pressure.
And just to say, I didn't get the riddle. I didn't get the riddle, so
no pressure.
This is going to be so awkward if you end up getting it straight away.
It will be even more awkward for me if I can't. So.
Okay, so the riddle is: a father is about to bring his son to a job interview, applying for a position at a large stockbroker's company in the city. Just as they arrive at the company's parking lot, the son's phone rings. He looks at his father, who says, "Go ahead, answer it." The caller is the trading company's CEO, who says, "Good luck, son, you've got this." The son ends the call and once again looks at his father, who is still next to him in the car. How is this possible?
The CEO is his mother?
Well, that's embarrassing for me. You've got it straight away. That's impressive. Okay, yeah. That was really impressive. Okay, I've asked quite a few people that riddle and no one got it.
Well, did you ask any women that question?
I did ask one and she didn't get it, but the majority were men and they didn't get it, which I find quite interesting, how there is like an unconscious bias when it comes to people in that high power, where people were saying, oh, it was I don't know, a close relative who calls him son. Someone said his grandfather. No one thought to say, well, the majority of them thought to say the mother or even like a grandmother. So that's great that you got that first time. I'm very, very impressed. Very impressed. You know what? I actually thought you'd have gotten it straight away. I was like, I think she'll get this. I don't know why. After we've obviously spoken quite a few times since our initial meeting about a year and a half ago. So I don't know, I just got the energy that you'd have gotten that straight away. But amazing, well done.
Pressure's on.
Just now you can relax. The rest of the podcast is going to be very easy. So just to start off, just give us a little bit of a background into you. Talk a little bit about, I guess, your university experience. Yeah. Obviously, you're from Canada. Yeah. So talk about your university experience, why you chose the degrees that you did, and then touch a little bit on kind of your early starting career in terms of clinical and working in hospital.
Yeah, I grew up in Canada, as you mentioned. I did a bachelor's degree in biology in, I'm trying to remember now, it was a while ago, animal physiology and microbiology. And then when I finished that, I got into nuclear medicine. And there were a few things. Once I did my bachelor's, I was toying up between speech therapy and medical radiation physics. But I was better in physics than I was in psychology. So nuclear medicine, that was the program that I got into. I did that for 2.5 years. And then once I wrote my Canadian national licensing exam that allows me to practice in Canada, I thought the world is my oyster and I was looking to go and travel somewhere. I'd looked at the UK, I'd looked at the US, but the US is not terribly different for a Canadian. So Australia was another option. And so I teed up my arrival here with the timing to write the Australian National Licensing exam, because I couldn't get a visa to work here unless I'd written that exam and I was legally able to practice here. Wrote the exam, passed it, and was lucky enough to get a job in Sydney. And I worked in a few hospitals in Sydney. I worked at North Shore Private, at Hornsby, Concord. So I had a big mix of public and private. But the longest tenure was at North Shore Private. And then I did that for about 5 years and had a friend at the time, a colleague, who got into Novartis. And that really tweaked my interest in terms of clinical operations and the R&D side of pharma. And so I made the jump to Roche, and I started off as a CRA, so a clinical research associate, and then worked my way up in the 10 years that I was there.
So just to go back slightly, so in terms of your start in terms of clinical and hospital in Australia, did you do any of that back in Canada?
When you do your training, you do have like a residency type thing. So I did that in Canada.
Yeah.
But as soon as I got my licensing exam, I came down to Australia.
And how did that kind of compare between Canada
very
and
similar. So Canada is often considered like Australia, but just on ice. So it's very similar in terms of its education, its healthcare. But I guess the one big difference is there's no private hospitals. There's no private sector. So that opened up some extra job opportunities, if you will, because there's probably, double, maybe triple the number of hospitals in Australia compared to Canada, simply because there's only the public sector.
Oh, amazing. So you moved to Australia, you worked in hospital, both private and public, while you were here, and that was over a 5-year period. And then you said a friend was working for Novartis. So what about your friend working at Novartis and their kind of career, and what intrigued you to kind of move out of clinical and then I guess into pharma? I guess your first role into pharma and Roche.
Yeah, well, she got into clinical operations and the R&D side as well. And I guess what appealed to me, twofold. Not having to work on call anymore and getting 3 a.m. phone calls that a patient was sick. So that was a bit appealing, but also the aspect of constantly learning and being exposed to cutting edge research, learning about new diseases and new drugs. That component of the job really appealed to me. And although you are working in pharma, you're very closely related to the patients. You don't deal with them one-on-one, but you're recruiting patients into clinical trials. So you do have that sense of being very patient-centric and being really motivated on how well they can do.
Did you feel as if you moving into the pharma industry with Roche was more of a passion for you and a way of you feeling as if you're giving back more than you would have in the clinical side, or was that like a thought that you felt, oh, this is what I would like to use my knowledge and my experience to get back to patients?
My clinical experience was definitely very helpful. Working in the R&D side, you are dealing with the medical notes, you're scrutinizing the medical notes, so you do have to have an understanding. So definitely my background was very helpful. But I guess what really drove me was the hope. So generally patients don't go on clinical trials unless they're failing their current therapies. So it was the hope that we could potentially provide them. Now, having said that, I've worked on big phase 3 studies that have failed, and it's equally as devastating when that happens, because you're so invested in the hope in helping these patients where there's no other therapies available. So it's a double-edged sword, but yeah, it definitely was inspiring to be part of the process and part of the movement forward in the hope for treating these patients.
And what usually happens whenever you're obviously going through a clinical trial and it doesn't pass the stages? Is it kind of a let's start from the beginning and work our way back up, or do you guys just end up moving on to something else, or how does that work? Just to give the listeners a slight insight.
There's no easy answer. I've been on projects where they have failed and they've canceled them immediately, and then the company itself will reprioritize and put their investment into something else. It might not be that therapeutic area. But I've also been on projects where they have failed, but there is information that they've been able to get out of it. So that might end up being that they've identified certain biomarkers that might be a predictor of disease progression or response to the drug. And so they might use that information to help redesign the protocol and re-scrutinize the inclusion criteria. So it really depends on the company and what their priorities are. At that time, it could also be the competitive landscape. If there's a lot of companies that are looking at that particular indication, that might be an excuse for the company to just cut their losses and move into a different direction. But, clinical trials they provide invaluable research, and they help to further the scientific understanding of the diseases that we're trying to treat. Even if they don't meet their endpoint, there's still valuable information that can be had. So it's just all about learning and exploring new opportunities.
For sure, it's almost like a win-win in some kind of ways, even if it doesn't really get through all the phases. There's so much really positive information gathered from that can then, I guess, in turn, then be used for other potential diseases down the line. Close enough to the COVID vaccine and the theory that was used behind that. It wasn't a new kind of
technology.
Technology. It was already been used and been created for above decades. So I totally get that. So let's kind of touch on your experience at Roche. You were there for 10 years. That's a long time. That's you're getting really long months of leave after 10 years. So that's a commitment. How was your experience there? Because obviously you went from originally a clinical research associate, which you were that for about 4 years. How was that, and the progression from there to a medical manager?
Yeah, I mean, I really enjoyed my time at Roche, and that really formed the foundation of my understanding of the industry. When I first became a CRA, it was a very steep learning curve, understanding about the TGA and the PBS and just the Australian pharma industry and landscape itself. It took about 4 years for me to get comfortable within my role and how it fit in within the company, and to really get an understanding of where I might want to progress. Because when I first started, it was so overwhelming. I couldn't imagine doing anything other than the job that I had. And then after that, I became a project manager, and the way that Roche's structure was, it was a regional project manager. So I looked after the Asia Pacific region, excluding China at that time. And then I went into a therapeutic area lead, which was really more around the strategy and bidding for the studies that came to Australia, and really placing the best ones in Australia that fit the Australian landscape. That also took into consideration the competitive landscape and what comparators we had available in the country. And then after that, I had the opportunity to be a medical manager in pipeline products and early pre-launch. So I felt really, really grateful to have been exposed to so many different aspects of the product life cycle.
You said after it took you about 4 years to get comfortable being a clinical research associate, which sounds, I'd imagine going into something new like that would take that length of time. So after those 4 years, was it kind of an active decision and and more of a decision for you to, okay, I'm quite comfortable now, I need to do something else to push myself? Or was it kind of a steady progression where?
No, it was definitely intentional. I had some great line managers that would always ask me what my next step was, that really encouraged me to think about my next move, even if it might have been in 2 years, and helped expose me to some of the things that would help build my competencies for when I eventually either had the job or applied for the job.
Awesome. And was there anything that you did specifically to get to that level? Were there courses that you did, or were
Yeah,
there, I guess,
we
any
had some
specific
internal.
mentors?
Yeah, I mean, I guess my managers at the time were good mentors. We had some online courses. There's different competencies. When you are a project manager, you don't necessarily have to have that keen focus on the detail. You need to step back and understand the global remit, and then the sites and the hospital's remit, and how you fit in between. So there were definitely courses on project management and having that broad level oversight. Because when you are responsible for so many more sites and countries, you just can't have that focus on that one site. So there definitely were internal courses and coaching courses that we were exposed to.
Awesome. And then obviously you've left Roche, and then you moved on to Clarity Pharmaceutical, wasn't that right? Yeah. So you were with Clarity Pharmaceutical for, if I remember correctly,
just a year.
Just over a year. Yeah, just a year. So why Clarity? Because from what I understand at the time, it was a smaller company.
Yeah.
So what made you choose to go there? Because I mean, after 10 years with Roche, quite a well-known pharmaceutical company, I imagine there were many choices and many places that you could have potentially have gone to. So what about Clarity Pharmaceutical kind of enticed you to go, and just give us a bit of insight about that.
Well, I had really enjoyed my time at Roche and had been exposed to a lot of different departments, but I guess I'd always had that concern that was the only company that I'd been exposed to, and I was worried that maybe I would have been a bit pigeonholed in the industry. Yeah. And Clarity Pharmaceuticals was a small startup biotech that was actually looking at radioactive isotope for the purpose of diagnostics, but also therapeutics in a certain type of cancer treatment. So the opportunity to go with them and be a bit of a strategic advisor and help identify a particular niche market that dealt with neuroendocrine tumors was really interesting. I'd never been involved in that kind of cancer when I was at Roche, but also having a really broad understanding of the oncology landscape from my time at Roche was really helpful to sort of understand where this would fit in the treatment landscape. And it was an opportunity to get American experience in Australia. So their target audience, or their target health authority, was the FDA. And when you generally work for a big pharma company, in order to get that American experience, you have to be based in the US. So it was an opportunity to get American experience based in Sydney, because the actual scientists for Clarity were based in Sydney. So it presented itself with a lot of interest, particularly the background was in nuclear medicine. So the first hospital that I went to go and work on one of their trials was actually the one hospital that I used to work at. So I got to work with the old doctors that I used to, the radiation scientists. Wow. So that was a really fun experience. And it was great to learn about not necessarily a new market, because I did have that experience from my clinical background, but to get the American IND experience based in Sydney was really great as well.
And obviously, Clarity being quite a small pharmaceutical company compared to Roche, how did that compare in terms of the culture, I guess? How did you kind of fit in when it compares to a bigger company to a smaller one?
I guess some of the appeal to it was they weren't so process driven like Roche had, because they had it was a bigger company. They had more defined processes. Clarity, being a startup, was just establishing themselves. So there wasn't, you had a bit more opportunity to do different things. I guess I had many hats. I was also a project lead, taking one of their products, going from the animal preclinical phase into phase 1. I was exposed to, I guess, some of the chemistry and manufacturing, logistics on delivery, because radioactive compounds can't go very far because they decay. So there was an opportunity to get to do a lot of different things. And that was one of the appeals when you work for a biotech. As you get bigger, you obviously work in your siloed department. So it was very interesting to be exposed to various, I wouldn't even say departments, functions within the company.
Yeah. I do find that when I've spoken to other people, they say whenever they work in smaller companies, you end up wearing
multiple hats,
many different multiple different hats, as you say. But in my opinion, I think that's such a such a great thing as well, because you do get an insight into so many different departments within any sort of company. I guess when you work in, as you said, those larger pharma companies, or if you're in corporate, when you work in those larger ones, you are quite siloed into just one area, and you don't really know what else is going on in the company. So I
or
guess,
what other
from
drivers
that standpoint,
or whatever
exactly.
stresses. And I guess ultimately, now I'm back at Alexion. Well, I'm at Alexion, back in clinical operations, and I guess after all of that, it's really driven home that clinical operations is probably where my passion and my interests lie. But having done so many different things and different functions within the life cycle of the product, I feel it makes me do my job better in clinical operations, because I have an understanding of what the drivers are for, medical, market access, commercial. So it was all good experience for me in the end, even though I found myself working back in clinical operations.
Awesome. And funny enough, you just touched on the fact you are at Alexion Pharmaceuticals now. Been there for about
Just
2
2
years.
Yeah.
Give or take. So how is life at Alexion been your new role? Just remind us of what the role is, and kind of a bit of background on what exactly it is that you do in this role.
So I have been there for 2 years. I'm the Associate Director for Project Country Operations Management. So basically overseeing the trials that come to Australia. And I guess our drivers are driving more clinical trials to Australia and New Zealand. And it's a company that specializes in rare diseases. It's actually just been bought by AstraZeneca, but it's the rare disease unit of AstraZeneca.
And in terms of rare diseases, what rare diseases are you guys kind of working on at the moment?
So some of the commercial ones are more hematology and nephrology based, but we've got quite a few metabolic genetic disorders that are in the pipeline as well.
Awesome. And obviously, as an associate director, you're in quite a senior leadership role. How does it feel to be as a woman in such a high senior leadership role, where I guess based in history and in pharma, it is usually men that are in those kind of high roles? How has that process been, finally getting to that sort of level?
Yeah, I mean, when I was at Roche, within ClinOps, it was definitely more female driven, but outside of that, and the GM at Roche had only ever been a man in the time, and even now to this day. But my current position, I report to a woman. She's the regional head of country operations management. And up until late last year, the head of our medical department was a woman, the head of our market access is a woman, and our GM is a woman. So there have been plenty of women in senior leadership positions at Alexion. So it's certainly very inspiring. And I feel like I've definitely been able to follow some of their footsteps.
And how do you find and feel about a woman's approach when it comes to leadership in comparison to, I guess, the leadership that you would have had at Roche? And I'm assuming the leadership in Clarity was also
that was
male-based.
Yeah, mostly male-dominated.
How do you find that kind of
in my
experience,
I think, to be honest, in the last 2 years at Alexion, the bulk of that has been over the pandemic. And so there's been a lot of fear, a lot of concern in that time. And our GM led the team with a lot of empathy. So I'd have to say, in my experience, it was, we still had our metrics that we needed to deliver, our goals that we needed to deliver. We had commercial expectations that we had to meet. The company did, not in ClinOps. But she approached it with a real sense of empathy and making sure that we were feeling okay, managing, because there was obviously a lot of fear if you did get COVID and how you'd feel and what have you. So, I think in my recent experience, it's definitely been more of a soft skill approach and leading with a lot of empathy and caring.
Yeah, and I guess it's what everyone knows. The experience that we've all had with COVID has been something that's been completely new to every single person that's currently on this earth. And I guess it was almost trying to navigate the unknown, trying to understand and appreciate that everyone is going to be in a completely different situation. Yeah. For example, I know you have your home, you have a husband, you have a kid, So I guess it's also trying to realize that, okay, I guess everyone has always been coming into the office for the better part of, I guess, 50 years plus. How are we going to navigate this when we have you, for example, who is a senior leadership role, and now your child is running around
and you're
your living room while you're and you're homeschooling?
Yeah.
What are our options? I guess, I guess from what you said, the empathetic side and giving people the wiggle room to kind of figure it out.
Yeah, and that's exactly what they did. So as a company, we tried to block out meetings from 12 to 2. And, I guess when you're dealing, when your key stakeholders are clinicians and hospitals, you don't always get that luxury of having that block between 12 and 2, particularly when you're trying to get a hold of a doctor. You might only get them over their lunch break. But by and large, as a company, they didn't place meetings in that time to give people a bit of wiggle room, to give people the chance to catch up on things, particularly if people were homeschooling that day. So there was definitely a lot of wiggle room, and there was no 9 to 5 concept anymore. So people were definitely in a position where they could work later on in the evenings or whenever it suited them. And I appreciate a pharma company, although we're very patient centric. It is a business after all, and if you don't, if the commercial team isn't able to connect with their key stakeholders and make sales, there's not going to be a business at the end of the day. For us in clinical trials, we still had to make sure that we recruited our patients. And that was really rather difficult over the 2 years, particularly when we were in lockdown, because a lot of patients were scared. A lot of hospitals had actually imposed sanctions that they weren't recruiting any new studies. So there was still that pressure to make your targets, but it seemed because of the wiggle room, that pressure had dissipated. And the company had given a lot of self-care gifts, which, I think is probably not something that a lot of men would think of, but there was a lot of nice things that were sent to us as a thank you for everything that we'd been going through. And those little things certainly did help over the 2 years.
That's awesome. Yeah, with our company as well, they've sent through a few times a few little care packages to everyone.
Wine.
Yeah, chocolate, candles, champagne.
Yeah.
We pretty much sent it to everyone, and they're like, no one open your gifts until their Friday's Zoom call.
Same.
And everyone just opens it up at the same time.
Although we made the mistake once
those little touches just go a long way.
Sending cheese, and then people didn't put it in the fridge. So now we've had to be very explicit on this requires refrigeration, place in the fridge before the meeting. So we learned the hard way.
Oh, that's amazing.
But those little things did go a really long way.
Those little things go a long way. And just to finish off, I just want to talk a little bit about pharma and how you see the future landscape being, and what your hopes are for the future within pharma.
I really hope, particularly in clinical operations, you don't work solely within the Australian business. You actually report to a global function, which means global time zones. So that can get very exhausting if you aren't afforded the flexibility. To date, I've had that flexibility, but I do hope that pharma as an industry adopts this flexible way of working so that we can integrate our personal lives with work, because it's not really a 9-to-5 job.
Awesome. Wow. Thank you very, very much,
My
Jessica,
pleasure.
for sitting down with me for this amazing podcast. Again, your career and what you've done, coming from Canada, working in clinical into pharmaceutical, making your way to the position that you are now is something amazing. Your career progression has been amazing, and something that people should really, I think, in my opinion anyway, and hopefully they agree once they listen to this, is something to aspire to. But again, thank you very much for taking the time out.
It's been my pleasure.